terms of Johnson and his strategist Dominique Cummings, that I'd like to hear a little bit more about, are they as savvy as they seem to be?
Been open to massive the Tories, and neither of them are particularly to do with the brains behind the throne. I mean, one of them is that the main one is that they have got lucky with the whole Brexit, which was a kind of weird accident that it happened at all. And, it has played well because it's become, the Brexit question has become very, very divisive in both Labour and actually in the Tories, but crucially in this instance, in Labour, or in the sort of broadly progressive left. And in particular, Brexit became a kind of lightning rod for people's discontent against the wider status quo. And by the Tories, by being pro-Brexit, they've actually managed to, and by pushing, or by Labour allowing itself to be pushed into a more and more openly Remain position, it's kind of created a culture war that can be exploited. And that's really the main problem with this election. The other thing that's worth saying, by the way, is that, and this is probably no surprise to your listeners, but it needs to be said because it's so blatant, is the extent to which the media terrain is so loaded against the left. I mean, there's only one mass circulation or the mainstream media outlet in Britain that is pro-Labour, which is the Daily Mirror. Out of all of the outlets, they're all basically hostile. And even the Daily Mirror is not very friendly to Jeremy Corbyn. So there isn't, there's no one in the mainstream batting for him in those, and that's going to have an impact. So I'm not so sure it's about, Cummings being this brilliant strategist, really. I think it's that the Tories, and Boris is such an idiot, he's clearly exposed himself as being, a kind of very poor operator. There was all this talk about him being a great communicator. Well, that's obviously not true because they've just tried to kept him locked up in a box throughout the whole campaign because they know he's not. So I think it's more the kind of wider context. And if it wasn't for this wider context, I think genuinely that, it would be very much easier for Jeremy Corbyn to have won probably a majority in reality.
Yeah. So, obviously there's a just stunning media warfare against Corbyn, and I've definitely covered that on every outlet that I have. And as part of that warfare, I do want you, it seems like so much of what's happening in today's politics is that there is a resurgence in interest in, let's just broadly say, socialism. I think because of objective material conditions and facts, and there's a openness to a much broader set of ideas and really class-based analysis in a way that is particularly noticeable in the United States. And then on the other hand, we run into these scenarios where it does seem like, and this is very bad, maybe you'll give us some hope in a few minutes, that there still are these just sort of simple culture war elections. And when I say culture war, I don't mean issues at stake, whether we're talking about equity for people, the rights of refugees, fighting racism and so on. I'm talking about culture war elections, which is I am programming different content to different audiences and I'm brand identifying different things. I like Brexit, so I hate sushi. I loathe Brexit and I want sushi. This type of sort of, very much kind of like what TV programs you're watching, extension of politics, which erases the class and structural dimensions to it. And it seems like Brexit and the UK have been totally subsumed in that. And that's where people like Tony Blair want, it's not left versus right, it's open versus closed. And I get that we can all analytically reject that, but it still seems to have a salience for a lot of people, particularly when the media is forwarding that narrative.
Yeah, I think that's true. And, it's a little bit complicated because in a way, I would argue that the left hasn't played its cards particularly well on Brexit because, the analysis of why the majority of people who voted to leave was always going to be a very crucial question. And I think whole sections of the left and the sort of, the Liberal left actually got it wrong and read it simply as a reactionary vote, without understanding the contradictions of it, the fact that there was a very strong element of it being a rejection of the kind of Westminster elite, and also it contained within it an element of rationality, in my opinion, which is that, people felt the EU is completely undemocratic, and that actually the only democratic institutions we do have, however weak and feeble, they are based on, the national state and parliament and so forth, and that's actually a higher level of democracy than exists in the EU, which I think is personally, I think is demonstrably true. So I think there has been a problem with the way the left has played it, which has allowed it to become something that can be instrumentalised against them too much. And I think Corbyn has tried his best to, in a hostile world, in a hostile context of the Parliamentary Labour Party, and even lots of Labour members who I don't think, necessarily took didn't quite grasp it in the way that I would have done. Right. So I think there's an element to it. I think, and on top of that, I think the other element that really has to be understood here is that relates very, very it regenerates an already existing sense of betrayal, deep, deep, deep sense of betrayal by all politicians in Britain, which obviously is to do with, particularly in Britain, is to do with the whole Blairite experience and the Iraq War, but also just the way in which Blair, turned the Labour Party completely into a pro-market operation. And again, that's completely rational. I mean, how can you blame people for that? And then when you have on top, for a lot of us know on the left that Corbyn stands for something different. He stands actually for a break from that kind of, free market consensus and the lying, cynical politics. But, not necessarily that message hasn't necessarily got out to the wider world. And Brexit has helped to stop it getting out to the wider world. Because the truth is, Labour's position is, it's changed from being one, we will recognise the result of the referendum and go for a people's Brexit, to really, we won't recognise the first vote and we're going to have another referendum. And that has created a sense of betrayal around lots of people. So it kind of is a culture war, but in a way, I think the left has allowed it to become that. Could have played could have played our hand much more strongly, in my opinion.
That's interesting. I mean, I'm going to take that in. That's definitely different than what you hear from literally everybody. Which has a good, but that's advent. Yeah. I mean, it's always struck me that they've never, it seems policy wise pretty, that Brexit's definitely a bad call, but people have never had an answer anytime I've ever said, okay, there is a leave vote in Labour. What do you do about that? That's always glossed over. And I've never heard an answer to that from anybody who's, advocated that they need to reverse position. You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.